Hello everyone, and welcome to the first IGP Soundbite of this term. It's my great pleasure to welcome Sarah Dew from Camden Council. Sarah is Head of Policy Design at the Council. She's leading the Council's Secretariat for the Renewal Commission, which is an ambitious mission-oriented programme of policy design to build a more inclusive, sustainable economy in Camden. Prior to this, Sarah was working with Camden's inclusive economy team to design what is good work for Camden. And before joining Camden, Sarah was an innovation consultant at the not-for-profit innovation unit, where she led a diverse program of work across the public and not-for-profit sectors. This included research into scaling and spreading innovation in the NHS, and a year-long innovation program to co-design community approaches to end-of-life care. So Sarah has a wealth of experience to share with us. We're very lucky to have her with us today. And she's going to talk about locally led experimentation, how you do experimentation. And she's going to link that to testing components of universal basic services, because Camden has been working with the IGP to test out this new approach to the redesign of the welfare state for the 21st century. So Sarah, please join us, and I am opening the floor to you now. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. And first of all, I'm just going to say, let's keep fingers crossed that the tech works. So do flag to me if you can't hear me. But it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today and connect virtually. I'm going to keep this quite light touch and informal, sharing some of the work, as Henrietta said, about that we've been doing in Camden to think about how we redesign services, and specifically how we redesign elements of our welfare system in recognition of the ways in which they're not working currently for the community of Camden. So specifically, I'll be talking about some prototypes that we did last year before the pandemic hit, to test components of a universal basic services offer in light of some of the thinking we've been doing around people's journey into work and how we can best support them into good quality work. There are quite a few other things that I could talk about today that I think are interesting and exciting that are happening at Camden, that bring to life a different set of values about how public services should be delivered, and about how the public sector should relate to and have a relationship with their community. But I'm not going to talk about all of those things today. I'm going to focus on some of the work the inclusive economy have been doing. And the other bit of framing I wanted to do before I get started is to say that I'm not here today to talk about things that we know for sure, or questions that have been solved, or pieces of work that are finished. I think I'm joining you today at a moment where things are in progress, and there are lots of new questions for us to think about and to ask. I guess some of the work I'm talking about today, as I mentioned, started before the pandemic, talking about issues of good work and unemployment 18 months ago was a really different type of conversation than the one we're having today, one that is characterised by greater uncertainty, greater severity perhaps than we have faced in decades, if not before. And so the context has really shifted. And so I'm hoping that today is an opportunity for me to share with you where we're at, share with you some of the work that we've done, and also perhaps create a bit of space for us to talk together about how we might go forward from here, and recognise that there are lots of things that are still unsolved. And as we look to that journey, again, just want to thank all the colleagues on the call from IGP who've been working with us on the journey so far, and as we look to this quite uncertain future. So that's my framing, which hopefully doesn't sound too much like caveats to saying I really just don't want to come across as saying I'm going to be here to give you neat and tidy answers, because that would feel a false claim. So I'm just going to share my screen and talk you through a few slides. So as has been said, talking today about some of the local work we've done in Camden to test components of universal basic services, which I imagine is a conversation that is happening live and active in your studies, but that we've been trying to translate a bit into practice in Camden. And there are four things I want to talk about today. The first is why I think it matters to have this conversation, why I think it matters to talk about universal public services and thinking really innovatively and creatively about public sector reform. I want to talk to you a bit about what we've done and what we learned from that, and then look ahead a bit to the opportunity and challenge for local places like Camden, when we look forward to how we might take these early lessons and apply them at a greater scale. So I want to start today just like reflecting on why it matters, as I said, to have this conversation and to talk about how we can provide the best platform in society for people to be able to participate socially and economically. And it will be a well-rehearsed conversation for all of you about why there are many failings and failures in the way in which our current welfare system works. We could talk about the 5-week wait. We could talk about the issues around conditionality and the culture that it creates in providing support, and how that doesn't really meet people where they are in their lives. But often I think that conversation doesn't really profile enough the lived reality and the personal stories of people, and how the failures of the current system affect them. So I just want to share a few of those. So the current setup of our welfare system means that people have experiences like not being able to afford food for them or for their families, even if they are working or in receipt of benefits, which means that neither work or our welfare system currently offer people a route that protects them out of poverty. Our current welfare system also leads to issues like people not being able to afford to get the bus to go and get the voucher that means they can access a food bank, and not being able to get the bus to go to the food bank or to get the food home from that food bank to their house, which means they might spend several hours in central London walking to try and access some of the emergency support services that exist for people when they fall through our safety net. It also means that people might leave for a job interview that's at 11 in the morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, so that they can get on the tube before the peak fares charges start at 6:30, because they can't afford to get the tube at the time that makes sense to make the journey to get to the interview on time. So they will arrive and walk along the streets for a couple of hours, killing time, building that anticipation and that nervousness for an interview, because they can't afford to travel at the time that makes sense for them to do that job application. And I guess we all know what it's like to wait for a job interview, and how those things might affect the state of mind that you're arriving when you go and then have the interview. It also leads to people not being able to book GP appointments because people might not be able to afford internet access at home. They might access the internet in the library, and the library opens after the time that the GP online booking system, everyone's excited because it's online and accessible, but that might open at 7 in the morning and the library might not open until 9. And so by the time you can get onto your slot to get online in the library, those GP appointments have been booked up, and therefore your ability to access basic primary care is really prohibited. And our welfare, some of the setup around how our society works now means that people are perhaps in a bank lobby or in a fast food restaurant trying to fill out the paperwork online that they need to do to access their benefits, or to be able to apply for a job, because they can't afford to have internet access in their own home. So I just wanted to ground us a bit in why it's important to have this conversation, because there are really capable, resilient, creative people who are finding workarounds to a system that takes them a huge amount of emotional energy and time, because our system doesn't work well for them at the moment. And that's why it's important for us to have this conversation. There are really brilliant people navigating these challenges right now that we could do better by if we thought more about their experiences and wove them into the way in which we think about policy design. So I wanted to start there today. And now perhaps I'll go back to something that might sound a bit more familiar from a sort of policy design speak. So I guess about 2 years ago, Camden started talking about how can we better support people into good quality work. We knew that at that time there were not very many people unemployed, but those that were tend to be locked out of work for a long period of time, structural unemployment that was hard to shift. And increasingly we're seeing people, as I mentioned, being in work but not being able to do the things that make life good. So work wasn't working for them, they weren't earning enough, and that work wasn't secure or stable enough. And so we had lots of conversations with people in Camden to understand what those barriers to work were. And here is a bit of a map that you won't be able to read, that is hopefully shows a little bit that it's a complex web when we think about the reasons why somebody's not able to access work. That's a really complex picture. And we started to think about what it might mean for us to respond to those challenges that we'd heard. And I've got some stuff in here about context change that we've already spoken about. So having listened to people's experience, we identified a few places that we might start to act. One was setting up really relational human support in people's communities where they live to support them on a journey into work that was much more about creating a strong personal relationship, understanding people's goals and ambitions, and having a close partnership to support somebody on that journey. And so we've now opened a couple of new job hubs in the borough that are based in our communities where we understand there to be most need for that support, and we'll be opening more of those going forward. And we've got a really talented, relational, warm group of people supporting people on that journey. We also recognise that you can support people lots to feel like they're ready for work, but actually often there are problems in the jobs themselves. They might not be able to access them for whatever reason, or they might be poor quality work. And so we're in the beginnings of setting up an inclusive business network that is intended to bring together businesses and improve their business and employment practice. And we're working to make our employment and skills network of support work more effectively. But even if you look at those bits of the jigsaw puzzle, it felt like there were things still missing. There were tools and skills that people needed to be able to participate in our society and an economy, that providing those things alone wouldn't be sufficient to make a difference in some people's lives. And there would still be things that they were lacking. And so we started to look a little bit more at that jigsaw bit of the jigsaw puzzle that we probably didn't really understand and felt like a newer space for us as a local authority, particularly if we remember that most of our kind of benefit system from a welfare perspective is administered at a national level. So that felt like a new space for us to start to think about what we might do. And we identified two particular areas that felt rich for sort of experimentation and to delve in more detail into. Again, this came through from the conversations we were having with people who live in Camden. And the two elements that we started to think about in particular were access to the internet, both data and devices, and then access to transport. And I've already talked about some of the challenges that not having access or easy access or fair access to those things can mean in the day-to-day of people's lives. So we thought about those two areas, and actually it was in conversation with IGP that we started to think about those through a lens of universal basic services. What are those things that people need that go beyond health and education to be able to have secure livelihoods, to be able to live well? And we wanted to understand what is it that we might do about that. And we did two things really. We did more research, and by research I mean some of that being desk-based, but I mean a lot of that spending time with Camden residents, talking to them and trying to hear in their own words and their lived experience what was important to them, what the challenges were that they faced. And then we had a phase of testing and doing things on the ground. I think it's often tempting in a policy space to think lots and think hard about hard and interesting and complex questions until you get to an answer that feels good and right. But often those people that are thinking about that aren't the ones that are most directly impacted by the experiences that you're talking about. And so the intention of our testing phase was to start really small and start testing early so that we were learning with the people that we were working in service of to understand from them what worked, rather than try and design that ourselves sat in an office, and a nice kind of central London office, which unfortunately is not where we're sat now. So we did two things in terms of those testing. When it came to thinking about transport, we worked with a small cohort of people and gave them a 1 month zone 1 to 3 travel card that they could use to do whatever they wanted with. So whilst we were interested and baselining measures on their journey into work, and I mean that in its broadest sense, so building confidence, social networks, well-being, as well as some of the more kind of process things that you might think about being a journey into work, people were free to use that card as they wished. And we did some baseline interviews with people when they came into that pilot. They did some kind of diary keeping and checking in with us over the course of that month, and then we did some reflective interviews at the end to understand their experience of being involved in this very small test and what that might mean for where we go next. And then when it came to internet and devices, we did a series of what we call paper prototyping instead. So rather than, we thought actually for a long time, was there an equivalent in the internet space? Could we give somebody a device and a Wi-Fi package, for example, that meant they could get online in the way they hadn't been able to before? And actually we realised again, there were loads of questions that we couldn't quite figure out about how we would do that. So we needed to go one step back and start using paper prototypes that were, I guess, we mocked up some ideas of what different packages, different things that people might need would look like, so that we could sort of lay them out on a table and people could do a bit of a pick and mix and we could have a conversation about the trade-offs, how things would work, rather than to again help us just answer some of those assumptions, unpick some of those questions. And so you might see here, where you might not be able to see very well, this last box here, we were hoping to do some engagement with big providers, and that got postponed because I think we actually realised last week when we were looking back that those last workshops happened in the week before we went into lockdown. And so this was really up until the pandemic hit that we were doing this practical experimentation, and we got loads and loads of rich insights from those conversations, and I'm going to share some of that with you now. So on that last one, on the access to internet and devices, I think it's probably it's interesting to look back now, because none of us would be surprised to hear the stories that came through now, but perhaps a year ago it was much less in the public consciousness, the extent to which this country has a digital divide, as we often now talk of it, and the cost of not being connected online. And so we learned through some of those paper prototyping sessions, as it goes without saying, the importance of digital connectivity for social and economic connection, being able to access core services and the kind of basic way of life in this country. But there are a few other things that I just wanted to highlight. And again, I think I mentioned it already, the emotional exhaustion that many people are facing as they try to find ways around not having access at home or easy access. So one example really sticks to mind for me of a resident who had a laptop at home, but not internet access. And so if they were going to a new place, for example, they'd been referred to a new service, a new public service. In order to work out how to get there, they would have to book an appointment at the library. They would have to walk to the library at the time of that appointment. They would take a screenshot of the journey on Google Maps, which they would put onto a USB stick that they could take home with them, to put on their laptop, which didn't have internet access, to look at the picture again of the journey, try and memorize it before they left the house to make that journey. And if you think about the time that it takes to make a journey, if those are the steps that you go through because you don't have access, and how prohibitive that is for you to be able to then access new experiences, go to places you haven't been to before, and do some of the things that are already required to be able to fully participate in society in the way that perhaps most of us do, then you start to see the time and the emotion that goes into navigating some of these barriers. And then another thing that came through very strongly in those practical prototyping sessions was some of the nuts and bolts about what you would need to design a service that really met people's needs. So we had lots of conversations about the barriers if you've got direct debits that need to be set up as a way of payment, and how off-putting that is, particularly if you have quite a fluctuating or uncertain income, and similarly long contracts, which often can provide you with the cheapest form of access. What a huge hurdle that is to overcome if you experience quite a lot of precarity in your day-to-day life. So there are lots of things about how you might structure a pilot or an intervention in this space that can be really richly informed by the things that you hear from people when you put stuff down on paper and see how they respond. And then on the transport pilot, which was the most kind of real world, I guess, of the things that we did, there was a really marked impact in people feeling more confident, more positive, real noticeable difference in the amount that people were able to meet with friends and family, but also people enrolling in new training and courses that they hadn't done before, people going to more job interviews than they had done previously, and people feeling far less isolated than they had before. And of course, this was a small, very, very small pilot. I'm not claiming any of the things that we learned from this are things we should generalize. There are obvious benefits from being able to have unlimited access to transport that are unsurprising. But I think what we started to do is make the case for why we need to look at some of the infrastructure that people are able to access, as well as the human relational services that enable people to kind of participate and to thrive. So I'm just going to finish now by talking very briefly about what we want to do next. So as I mentioned, the majority of this work in terms of its practical application happened before the pandemic. Since then, we've been making sense of that. We've been thinking and working closely with IGP about a kind of future direction of travel in a policy space in relation to universal basic services. but fundamentally we need to learn more by doing more, and as I said previously, doing things with our community and with our residents to understand in their words what works. And so we want to do a pilot this year that looks that goes deeper into the question of digital access in particular, and again, that we will learn by doing and hearing from people about what works for them and adapt as we go. We want to learn more by collaborating with others. We know that we only have part of the picture, and some of the things that we can't do are constrained by national policy. But if we're going to make a case for wider change, we need to think about how some of these ideas apply in really different contexts. So what would it look like if you weren't a central urban London borough to think about some of these questions? What kind of lateral learning might we get from some of these ideas being applied in different contexts? And what are the interesting partnerships and things we can learn with all the rich anchor institutions that exist in Camden, like UCL, that we can really learn with and go further in partnership. And then I mentioned very briefly there that we also want to be sharing what we've learned in recognition of the fact that there are limitations to what we can do alone, and some of those are statutory limitations about what we as a local authority do and what others do. And there will be also, you'll all be very aware of the kind of capacity and financial constraints on the public sector at the moment, and all of these things are constraints that limit some of the things that we can do, but also with constraint can come creativity to think about how we go forward and build a case for change, looking into the future. So I guess I'll finish there. That's kind of an overview of what we've done in this universal basic services space in relation to employment and inclusive economy so far. But I very much feel like it's we're on a journey, and it's not the end point at which I'm talking to you today. It's a midpoint in some way along that journey.
Sarah, thank you very much. So as we get into the questions now, everyone, can you please think about universal basic services in relation to the context you know best, whether that's the UK or somewhere else, and take this opportunity to reflect on the chance you have to talk to Sarah about how this really works on the ground and why it's important. So Sarah, before we go to the audience, who will be keen to talk to you, I can see the questions coming in on my right, and you probably can as well. I just want to ask a few questions to help orient some of our discussion. So, I mean, I think one of the things that people often are startled by when they hear an account like the one you've just given is trying to work out, why is the UK in this situation? Why is life in the UK so precarious? And you know, sort of at what moment did it become so precarious? And I'm not asking you to answer that in a long-running academic question. I'm just asking from the point of view of somebody who works on the ground as you do. What's your sense of that? How do you and your colleagues actually talk about that when you're working together on these things? Why has this happened, do you think?
I guess, I mean, there are 1,001 things that we can think about when it comes to why has this happened. And I'll just give a few that come to mind most instantly. So I think I've even done it today, that I've talked about the journey we've come on in thinking about universal basic services, starting from a point of employment. And often when we think about public services and the way public services are structured, they're structured around specific issues or experiences in people's lives. When the reality of people's lives is that they are so much more complicated than that, and you can't look at things in isolation. But our whole structure, so for the fact that we even have completely separate bodies to think about healthcare and mental health from, for example, social care, means that it's very difficult for us to do the genuine connection and make best use of our collective wisdom and knowledge. So I think there's a real barrier there to the fact that the reality of people's lives aren't really reflected in the way in which public services have been developed over decades, and we could speculate for a long time about why that is, but it is a really live conversation in the public sector at the moment about how you bring back in that real people's lives and experience into the conversation, and to be active agents in shaping the future of public services. So that would be one. I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that a funding situation it plays into that as well. Lots of things have been stripped out. That means also it's hard to be in that complexity if you're working at a kind of bare bones level. And then I think the other thing is, I guess arguably the world we live in is, well, not arguably, undoubtedly the world we live in now is very different from the welfare system when it started to be created. We wouldn't be having a conversation about digital access if we were having this conversation 70 years ago, and it's quite difficult. I think we're often reactive rather than looking forward to those changes that might be coming down the line, and how we can incorporate them in the way in which we both deliver services, but really just think about public service as a whole. And all of that has led us to today in a moment of crisis where the public sector is being reshaped in front of our eyes as we have to change and respond to the immediacy on the ground. Yeah,
no, that's very, very important that first of all, that the landscape of vulnerability changes over time. And of course, hopefully so does the landscape of opportunity, but those things don't always match hand in hand in any way for people themselves. But also just the framing of how we think about problems is important. And so thinking about people only from the point of view of an employment statistic is not a good way to think about the challenges that they're actually facing. So those are all very good points. But one of the things that in doing this work together that we're all very committed to is this notion of experimentation. And I know a lot of people who are joining us now are thinking, well, how do we deal with the notion of experimentation when you're a local authority? I mean, what are the limits of experimentation, or what might be, are there any ethical issues about bringing people into an experimental sort of way of policy development and policy formulation? So how do you think about that when you're talking to colleagues, those kinds of issues about experiments?
I guess, I mean, one of my first thoughts when you ask that question is that anytime we do something new, we're experimenting, whether we call it out or not. And so actually, probably historically, we've done some huge experiments, but they've been at a national scale and all rolled out at once. But the reality wasn't those experiments. We didn't really know what would happen because we hadn't done it before. And so I guess when we talk about experiments now, more explicitly, we are talking about things at a much smaller scale. And we're doing that in the service of learning, so that we don't get to that situation where we roll things out sort of with a bit of a fingers crossed and hoping that it will do what we thought it would. We're actually trying to de-risk. The intention is to sort of de-risk, validate, and prove through that process, rather than bake risk in. And I think one of the ways that you respond to that on an ethical level is to be really explicit about what is somebody engaging in when they come in. So if you're, for example, in the transport prototype, being really explicit that we are trying to learn about the barriers that people face to unemployment. We invite you to come and be part of that. It's going to be a defined period of time. We want to learn these kinds of things, and in exchange for you giving us your time, we will sort of recompense you for that as well. So we always give people payment often through vouchers to recognise the time and commitment they make to being part of that learning with us. But that certainly isn't an easy question, and I think one of the things that probably we debate on a lot is how you end things well, because actually in the spirit of experimentation, often you might do something that isn't in the longer term what you're going to end up being concluding as the outcome, and you don't want to create cliff edges for people where you give them some really intensive support for a period of time and then that drops off because you decided it didn't work at scale or something. And so I think I don't have a good answer to that, because that's I think quite a case by case situation, and the thing you've really got to do is be planning for the end of an experiment and what the follow on to that is, and also how you give somebody access to the other things that will stay beyond the life of that experiment that they can access. So we always will talk to people about the wide range of support that is sort of stable and in steady existence when we start something.
Well, I actually thought it was a really good answer, actually. But then it's because policies are fairly blunt instruments sometimes, isn't it? As you said, we've had plenty of massive policy failures in these areas in the UK where something's been conceived in Whitehall and thought to be a brilliant idea and then rolled out. And there's been a very expensive failure. So experimentation is partly to do with de-risking, not increasing risk. So that's an important part of it. So we've got questions now. Actually, the first one is from Ying Wang, and Ying is on the line, so she can actually ask it in person. So Ying, can you ask your question in person, please?
Yeah, Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your excellent speech. So actually, I want to ask a question about your experiment. So actually, I want to know what methods you have used to identify people's needs and how to identify universal needs from conversations with individuals, and also how to identify the word universal. Because actually, I want to know how to distinguish between the needs of a small group of people and the universal needs.
You started us on a small and easy question there.
Yeah, she built up to a real hard one at the end.
Yeah. So I guess I think I guess your question comes in a few parts. You asked about methods for identifying needs, and then I think the real humdinger is how you go from small, like personal conversations to extracting out a kind of sense of universality. So I'll start a bit on methods. So some of the ways of thinking, I guess, that we approach this is in the language of service design, which people on the call may or may not be familiar with, and thinking as things you've mentioned already, kind of deep ethnographic interviews. And ethnography gets thrown around a lot, so I guess it's ethnographic style rather than true ethnography of spending time with people talking very widely about their lives rather than narrowly about a particular, for example, we started at unemployment, but not talking about only unemployment, because actually you miss the richness of the context in which that issue manifests in somebody's life. So I guess wide interviews that we then do lots of kind of mapping of the themes that come through from those different conversations, and then playing in existing literature and understanding on top of that. So I think that gives you quite a rich framework that's both sort of bottom up and it's not really, well, top down is not really the right framing, but has a kind of more theoretical grounding, I guess. And then the universality need, from personal to universality, feels like a tricky binary, and perhaps not one that is worth spending loads of time on in some ways, because we had this conversation yesterday, actually, Henrietta and I, around the reality is people's needs are never going to be universal, I think, but there might be shared goals and interests that people are trying to achieve. So, not everybody wants the same job, but most people want a stable income in their lives that lets them live a good life in some way. But the route to getting there is different for all people. So I don't necessarily think that we are trying to aim for extrapolating out from a small group of people to a sense of universal understanding, but perhaps thinking thematically about the kind of common things that people might experience, the variety of experience, and how you design flexibility in to respond to that, rather than try to find a solution that fits all. So I'm not entirely sure if that answers your question, or whether I've just fudged my way out of it, but yeah, I don't think the aim through this type of working is to get to a singular view of need, but actually is to try and understand the complexity and be able to respond to it in the way in which services are designed. So that's why we often talk so much about the power of relationships, because actually if you create the space for public servants to spend time on building relationships with people, they are able to flex and respond to that person as they are in their lives, rather than giving people very discrete tasks for them to complete, because that doesn't embrace that richness. So hopefully that gives a bit of an answer to your big question, which I'll probably be thinking about for the rest of the day.
It does. And now we've got another person whom you know, Saffron, who can also ask her question in person. I think she's going to talk about scaling up. Saffron, I can't see you, but are you there?
I'm here. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for your presentation. You've touched on this a little bit, and Henrietta also did in her comments. But I wanted to ask a question about scaling up in kind of two ways, really. One is how you kind of expand and embed the experimental ways of working and innovation methods in local government more generally. So what kind of capacities are required in local government to be able to run these kinds of experiments, especially at this point in time when public services and public service officers are under so much pressure. How do we find the space, essentially? And the second aspect of scaling up is thinking about how you then move from experiments into longer term and more sustainable design and delivery of UBS. And you mentioned at the beginning that at the moment, much of the welfare system in this country is designed and delivered nationally. But the evidence that you were drawing on at the beginning, which is a really compelling example of why local context and specific kind of lived experiences need to be brought into design. How do you kind of balance out the tension between those things and think about at what scale UBS needs to be designed and delivered?
Nice, okay. All good things to get the brain working on Thursday. So on the first, about how you embed, expand and embed experimental ways of working, I can speak a bit to how I think about this in the Camden context, and I think it's a really live question that lots of the public sector is asking itself, and there isn't an easy answer. So I think in my mind, there are two elements of this. One comes back to what we've already said about the fact that experiments often happen without people calling them experiments. There's a world of the public sector that thinks about innovation and change and uses that language and talks about things in that way. But there are lots of people actually who do that work all the time, or often without conceptualizing it in that way. And I think culture and values are really important to enable that type of working. And we've seen it probably more than ever in the last year, that you will have people across the public sector at lots of different levels within that system who are adapting and changing in response to what they see on the ground and experimenting because they've had to. And I think a culture that prioritizes, again, relationships, connection to need, public service and duty and outcomes that people are trying to achieve enables you to move a bit in what it is that you do to achieve that outcome. So I think there's something about cultural values that's really important across organizations that means that a sense of experimentation isn't constrained to people that are kind of defined as doing that by their job title. In Camden, we've got a few different ways that we're trying this, and I guess our policy design team is a space where we're trying to build skills in sort of disciplined innovation methods, in using, in doing kind of work with residents, to generate new understanding, to translate that into insight and then into practical delivery, that we're trying to create sort of dedicated capacity in the organisation that can do that kind of thinking. And we've also got an inclusive innovation network that tries to bring people again across the organisation who are working in this way and have a kind of networked approach to thinking about change and creativity, I guess. And then when your question around moving from experiments to a kind of longer term scale within all the constraints we've talked about, I mean, I'm reminded of some of the conversations that we've had recently about the constraints that individual places can experience, but the power and richness of diverse experience when those different places come together and share different types of learning, and how that can create, that helps to create a case for wider reform, but can also inform of what we do and inform our practice and help us to change as well in light of what others are learning. And so there's scale within a place, but there's also scale across different places by planting new ideas that helps to foster change across the system, even if it doesn't come from a national directive. Within our local place, again, I think there's a limit to what we can do in terms of saying that we will deliver a certain set of services at huge scale, depending on the financing model that underpins all of that. But we can think about the way in which we deliver and use our existing resources that fulfill a set of values and principles that uphold some of the things we've been talking about today, that make best use of what we can do. And the reality is that public services have lots of legacy within them of things we've been doing for decades, and there's lots of potential and creativity for us to work within what we already do to embed a different set of values. And I think Camden's doing that across the board. There are examples across all of our services where they're working in different ways.
We did have a small follow-up question from Sophie Lantrebec, but I think you might have answered her question, because Sophie was asking, did your experiments have control groups? But actually, you're just making it very clear that this wasn't a randomized control trial.
Yeah.
And it was more that experiment really means kind of disciplined innovation in a way, rather than true experiments. So I think, Sophie, that's the answer to your question. And you want to come back on that, please do by asking another question. We've also got a question from Juan Manuel Moreno. So Juan is on the line and he can also ask it in person. Juan, are you there?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for your presentation and for sharing your work. My question is more of specific. You touch about on the aspect of ownership of these experiments and the fact that one of the big barriers to public services is that they're not often reflecting the life experiences of residents and the complexities at the local level. The question was sort of asked by Yin and how the experiments were designed with the participants. But my question related to that was if there has been any kind of follow-up with the participants from the initial experiments, or if there is a plan for that. And then the other question is related to a similar experiment that we've been collaborating the IGP with Popular Harka in Tower Hamlets on digital inclusion. And it's about participation in these experiments. One of the things that came out is many residents didn't initially want to participate because they thought they would have to pay for the experiment. So there wasn't a strong communication on that. And also were barriers in that they needed to cancel their contract with their internet providers that they had at the time. And that meant it was a big barrier to benefit from this experiment. I don't know if in the experiments with Camden you had some of these challenges or something similar, because I think it touches with the aspect of scaling up and connecting between stakeholders and the different how things connect for these experiments, and how someone who might really need these innovations might not be able to take part, or they don't think about it. No, this is not for me. I will have to cancel my internet and will have to pay a lot of money to participate for a few months, and it's not really worth it. And do you have something like that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm really pleased actually that you talked about that. One, because it makes me think, well, we should talk about what they did in response to that as we think about some of our work. And secondly, I think it really makes the case for, we were basically in that situation when we were thinking about our digital prototype last year, that we were getting into the complexities of all of these kinds of things. We had, well, it's strange that the time ended up being just before the pandemic, because we felt really constrained in time. And it turns out that was a good timeline to have, because it put such a train through everything. But in the time, we wanted to move at pace, and there were those kinds of questions that you just posed that we couldn't resolve quickly. And so that's why we decided instead to do this kind of more paper-based scenario, talking people through an imagined set of options rather than giving them those things. And I think what you've just described makes the case for doing that kind of work, because if there are those, if people are saying, well, I'm not going to do this because it has all these kinds of implications for me in my life, well, then that's a really useful thing to know as you begin to design something, because it helps you to say, okay, well, if that is the constraint or is a barrier, how do we respond? How do we design something that responds to that? And I think it really makes the case for talking as much as you can, as early as you can in the design of something with the people that will be participating in it, because it's only through talking to them that you'll uncover those things and then also be able to find a solution to it. I think it does speak a bit to some of the ethics as well around experimentation. And I think the onus then is on the design of the experiment to mitigate any of those risks to that individual. And again, that's where if you can start early and talking with people, you can take the steps that prevent that from being a barrier. But I do really hear that is that as you get at a bigger scale, you're asking people to step out of their current reality in a more significant way that might make it harder for them at the end of that. So again, that is just something you need to understand and plan for. I think your question about follow-up is is a really good one. And I think, in all honesty, in the intensity of what happened last March, we haven't done as much meaningful follow-up as we probably should have done, although we didn't commit to doing. We shared things with people that were the kind of outcomes of our conversations with them, but we didn't commit to them being sort of co-authors of any of the work with us. And I think there's a really interesting question there about how that could look different, and there's some work currently happening in our children's services where they're having a group of people who are sort of co-developing, co-guiding a sort of panel that has much more ownership over the design and shape of the experiment itself and how it reports. And I think that's an example of where the council's going much further to really embed community ownership. And you can also see that in some of the work we've done around responding to the climate crisis. We had a citizens assembly, out of which came a climate action plan, and then actually a physical space on our high street that was open access for people to come and kind of co-design and develop climate actions together, and a real sense of community ownership of those things. So I think experiments can sit on quite a lot of different scales when it comes to ownership, and to some extent I think that is dictated by the nature of the question, but I think we should always be striving and ambitious on that, and how we can bring more ownership into our community when we think about how public services change.
Great. And we've got a question on the chat from Hannah Sender, who's saying, thank you, Sarah. Did you find that there were other challenges which affected the impact of either the internet access or the transportation interventions, thinking of things like digital literacy and disability and so on?
Yeah, that is a great question, because digital literacy is sort of front and centre. We had a call earlier this morning as we start to think about the design of a more embedded pilot that brings together our teens and adult community learning and thinks about the connection of sort of skills and training along with stuff that people need in order to be able to get online. In terms of other barriers, there was some really interesting ones around transport, actually, in relation to how people feel in different forms of transport. If they have anxiety, for example, different forms of transport can be more or less appealing to people. And so it isn't just a financial barrier that we need to think about when it comes to people being able to get out and about. And again, that comes back to what we've spoken about earlier, that it's not useful to think about people through kind of siloed issue areas, that someone's mental health has a really significant impact on how they get out and about in the community, and all of that. All of that needs to be linked together. And I think one really obvious impact in the experiment itself is that we started to see people travel less at the end of that month, because there was a dawning understanding of what it was about that happened in March, or was already happened earlier, but it really led to lockdown in March. So that was an interesting example of how the real world impact on people's decision makings and how that gets reflected through into their behaviours. But only more richness for us, I guess, in terms of understanding people's decision making processes and seeing that play out in real time.
Great. So we got a couple more questions. First of all, from Chris Harker, who's saying, I'm interested in what we, and by that he means the academic community, can learn from you about the collaboration process. What works particularly well? And were there areas where collaboration wasn't possible or didn't work so well for some reason or other?
That's a really good question. So what can you learn from us about how to collaborate well? I think one of my big takeaways, and to be honest, I haven't reflected on this deeply, so it's very much live reflections, is that the process of us having really real relationships where we spend time in a room and we talk about things together is massively valuable in a way that reading reports, summaries, however pithy or insightful it is, doesn't translate in the same way when it comes to the thorny issues of implementation and practice, because often that complexity is incredibly hard to capture in a written way. And so whilst we as a local authority do engage extensively with the huge amount of research that comes out from academic institutions, it feels like it's a lot of information to absorb coming out all the time, and actually a half-hour conversation around a challenge that you're facing can be much more insightful in terms of how you might take next steps. So I think that's why we're really lucky in Camden to have people, partners in our borough on our doorstep in a normal world that we can meet and connect with and talk about things. And and then I guess one of probably, and I don't know this for sure, but my feeling is from so far is that things happen at a different pace in different institutions, and that perhaps when it comes to doing real world testing, and we've talked about this in the challenge of accessing funding, for example, to do things together, when there's pressure to do things quickly, that things happen at different paces in different organisations and in different systems. And I know that there's a challenge that probably you all face in accessing funding at different times, and to collaborate some of that stuff is really important. But I know that's something we're thinking about sort of together and how we respond to that. But I think, yeah, in-person time around real, genuine, real-life examples makes the application of that insight much more fruitful, I think, than more abstracted forms of outputs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we've got a question from one of our colleagues in the IGP, Matt Davis, and I think Matt can ask it in person. So Matt, there you are.
Thanks, Henrietta. Hi, Sarah. It was really lovely to hear your presentation. I've sort of been around the IGP for a long time and I hear about all this work, but we've never had the chance to meet, and it's really an introduction to the work. I have a quick observation and then a bit of a question that follows on from that. So when we talk about UBS, we often highlight the NHS or highlight education as an example of universal services that work at least relatively well in the UK. It seems to me, though, that there are also lots and lots of other examples of slightly more restricted, but to some extent universal services that we provide. And there are lots of these: universal transport for over 65s, universal payments for parents with young children. I know there are some caveats to all of these. But and there are many others. And it seems to me that there are quite strong precedents for a range of non-means tested taxpayer-funded schemes, like the kinds of trials that you're running. And in many ways, some people might interpret what you're doing as really radical, but to my mind, it'd be quite easy to sell it as completely non-radical and very much an extension of many, many things that we currently do, but we just forget that we do them. So that's sort of my observation. And then the broader point is that there are often things that we do legislate for, which also co-opt the private sector into certain responsibilities to deliver social aims. And they are perhaps relatively limited, and other people could come up with better examples of these. But the one that springs to my mind is that developers must provide certain forms of affordable housing. And we all know that that doesn't necessarily work very well, but it is a piece of legislation which co-opts the private sector. So I guess my question to you is, do you see the future of these trials as purely public sector led, or indeed public sector funded, perhaps then paying the private sector to deliver? Or do you see a stronger potential for engaging with the private sector, either through productive relationships or perhaps through leveraging legislation more forcefully?
So much in what you just said, and I think your first point is really interesting, and I think from a local authority perspective is particularly interesting actually around the visibility of what a local authority does, and lots of the things that we do, like you said, have this kind of characteristic, but perhaps aren't as visible or flagship in the way that they're held in the national consciousness as education and health. So in terms of the future of doing some of these things at scale, again, it's a very timely. We were having a conversation about this morning in the digital context, that I think there is a reality. I mean, there's a huge amount of politics embedded in that question, and I guess your view on the world about how society should run, which probably isn't worth getting into now. But I think there is real potential to think about how some of the insight of this type of working, and particularly I think the power of storytelling, which I think we've seen over the last 6 months with what Marcus Rashford has done, for example, that the power of storytelling in helping to create change, and actually the public sector sometimes being a voice to do that storytelling that can help influence the private sector in the way in which they structure their offer. And so from a digital perspective, it feels like there's a massive part of our society that have an experience that probably isn't known or understood by some of the big private sector organisations, that with relatively simple design could be structured in a way that is far more accessible and inclusive to a wider variety of people. And I think those things have to be in the mix as a way of thinking about a sustainable way of offering this into the future. And I think those that element about sort of advocating for difference in experience that might not get captured in the market in a kind of traditional way is an important role that we can play, and it feels a way, a good outcome for us to advocate for people on their behalf. So I guess I think your question was, where do you sort of, what balance do you see in? And I do feel like that gets into some much bigger and very personal questions. And I do think there is a role for the public sector to powerfully think about what are the universal basic services that people need and deserve fair access to. But the way in which we get there, I think, at least in the change process, could involve some kind of creative partnerships and greater understanding from key players in our society about the much more varied lived experience than perhaps people are often aware of.
Yeah. Very briefly, Matt, because I'm looking at the clock. Yes.
I mean, what were the basis of the initial discussions you'd had with the service provider? I can't remember, but were they on the basis that the council would fund, or that it would be gifted?
So we were talking about how we have that conversation rather than having had that conversation. And I think, I mean, there are lots of different models that you could think about, but you could think about one where there's a kind of minimum viable that for those that can't afford it themselves could be funded, and that then there's a more kind of, I guess, a kind of progressive scale of the different kinds of package and access that people need. But let's pick up a conversation on that, as that feels like the future work to be done.
Yeah, definitely. And we do need to discuss what the role of the state is here, and also what the role of business is. And we also do need to discuss or have discussions which people find difficult to have, which is that since the UK is a very, very low corporation tax environment, then some of these big corporations might need to be contributing to larger social goals through the work they do rather directly. So this is something that needs discussion. Well, as always, we get very excited in these sound bites and then we run out of time, which is a real shame. But Sarah, I just want to say thank you very much. We've had a really good start to the afternoon with your great talk and with your patience with our questions. And thank you very much. We look forward to lots of things that we're going to do together. And now, because we have a lot of people who are on the panel who are going to unmute themselves, we're going to give you a round of applause, which is one of the things we can actually do on this particular thing.
That's lovely. How well organised digitally, I appreciate that. And thanks for letting me join you and for challenging my brain as well. I really appreciate all your questions and all the time that the IGP have given to this work with us already. So yeah, massively appreciated.
We will do more. We will do more. Lovely to see you. See you very soon. Thank you very much.
Yes, see you soon. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.